Commander Jasper Sullivan stood at the observation deck of the International Space Station Harmony, his reflection ghosting against the reinforced glass as Earth hung like a jeweled pendant against the velvet darkness of space. After 20 years in diplomatic service, he thought he'd seen everything. He was wrong. "They're requesting you specifically, Commander." Admiral Harrison's holographic projection flickered slightly. "The Nexians haven't made direct contact with any species in over 3 centuries. Now their queen wants a private audience with you." Sullivan ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair, studying the data streaming across his neural interface. The Nexians were legendary among spacefaring civilizations, masters of biological engineering who had transformed their entire species through controlled evolution. They were watchers, observers, but never participants in galactic affairs. "Why me?" Sullivan asked, though he already suspected the answer. His unconventional approach to interspecies diplomacy had earned him both acclaim and criticism. While other diplomats relied on rigid protocols, Sullivan believed in the power of genuine connection. "Your work with the Centaurian peace treaties impressed them," Harrison replied. "They mentioned something about your unique perspective on existence. Whatever that means." Sullivan's neural interface pinged, displaying the formal request from the Nexian hierarchy. The language was precise, almost mathematical in its construction, yet there was something different about this communication. An undertone of urgency. "The Queen herself, Admiral. Not her representatives." "Correct. Queen Nixis specifically requested you. She's young by their standards, only assumed the throne 2 cycles ago. The Nexian Council seems concerned about her request." Sullivan turned from the window, his mind already racing with possibilities. "When do I leave?" "Their vessel enters our solar system in 6 hours. They're sending a quantum-fold ship. You'll be at their homeworld in less than a day." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Sullivan reviewed everything humanity knew about the Nexians, which wasn't much. Their society operated like a perfectly coordinated organism, each member fulfilling their role with precision. They had mastered the art of biological manipulation, transforming their bodies and minds to suit their needs. Yet they remained mysteriously isolated, sharing only the most basic technological advances with other species. As Sullivan boarded the Nexian vessel, he was struck by its organic architecture. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, and the air itself seemed alive with microscopic organisms that maintained the perfect atmosphere for both species. His escort, a tall Nexian named Thorn, moved with fluid grace. "The Queen awaits," Thorn said, their voice a melodious hum. "She has many questions." "I hope I have adequate answers," Sullivan replied, noting how the corridor seemed to respond to their presence, shifting subtly to guide their path. "You misunderstand," Thorn paused, their iridescent eyes focusing on Sullivan with unexpected intensity. "She has questions about humanity. About you. About how your species creates." Sullivan frowned. "Creates? We have shared our technological achievements with Dash." "Not technology," Thorn interrupted, a rare occurrence for a Nexian. "She wishes to understand how humans create meaning. Purpose. Joy." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sullivan had negotiated peace treaties, trade agreements, and cultural exchanges, but this was different. The queen of the most advanced civilization known to humanity wanted to understand something that couldn't be measured or quantified. As they approached the Queen's chamber, Sullivan noticed subtle changes in the ship's architecture. The bioluminescent patterns grew more complex, forming intricate fractals that seemed to tell a story he couldn't quite grasp. The air hummed with an energy that made his skin tingle. "Commander Sullivan," a voice like crystal wind chimes called out. "Welcome to my sanctuary." Queen Nixis was nothing like the formal, rigid Nexian Sullivan had encountered before. She moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost human, her form shifting slightly as if she couldn't quite decide on a single shape. Her eyes, unlike the typical iridescent Nexian eyes, swirled with colors that shouldn't exist. Your Majesty, Sullivan bowed slightly. I am honored by your invitation. The honor is mine, Commander. You stand before me as a representative of a species that continues to confound our greatest minds. She gestured to a living chair that grew from the floor. Please, be seated. We have much to discuss. As Sullivan sat, he noticed something in the Queen's chamber that stopped him cold. Along the walls, among the shifting patterns of light, were attempts at human art. Imperfect, almost childlike renditions of paintings, sculptures, and musical notes. You study human art, he said carefully. I study human creation, she corrected. Your species possesses something we have lost, perhaps something we never had. You create not just with purpose, but with passion. With joy. With pain. You make beauty from chaos and find meaning in randomness. Sullivan began to understand. This wasn't just a diplomatic meeting. This was a cry for help from a species that had engineered themselves to perfection, only to find that perfection might be its own kind of prison. Your Majesty, he said softly, what exactly do you hope to learn from humanity? Queen Nixis moved closer, her form rippling with emotions that her species had supposedly evolved beyond. Teach me, Commander Sullivan. Teach me how humans dream. The Nexian palace was a living symphony of biology and architecture, its walls shifting like frozen waves caught in eternal motion. Commander Sullivan watched as Queen Nixis paced the chamber, her form rippling with barely contained excitement. In the 3 days since their first meeting, she had bombarded him with questions about every aspect of human creativity. Show me again, she requested, gesturing to the holographic interface that hovered between them. Show me how humans make music. Sullivan adjusted the controls, and the chamber filled with the opening notes of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The Queen's body shifted in response, attempting to physically embody the music's rise and fall. Around them, the palace walls pulsed in harmony with the melody, the entire structure resonating with the ancient earth composition. Fascinating, Nixis whispered. Each time I hear it, the experience is different. How is this possible? Because you're different each time you hear it, Sullivan explained. Human art isn't just about the creation, it's about the interaction between the art and the observer. Each person brings their own experiences, emotions, and understanding to the piece. The Queen's form stilled, her iridescent eyes fixed on Sullivan. But the notes are the same. The mathematical structure hasn't changed. Art isn't just about structure, Your Majesty. It's about what lives in the spaces between the notes. The tension, the release, the expectations, and their violation, that's where the magic happens. Magic, she tested the word. Another human concept that defies quantification. Sullivan smiled, remembering his briefing about the Nexians' literal interpretation of language. It's a figure of speech. We use it to describe experiences that feel larger than their component parts. The Queen moved to a wall where she had attempted to recreate various human paintings. Her versions were technically perfect but somehow lifeless, like photographs of paintings rather than paintings themselves. We Nexians have achieved mastery over our biological forms. We can reshape ourselves at will, adapt to any environment, even rewrite our genetic code. Yet we cannot create anything truly new. That's not entirely true, Sullivan countered, gesturing to her artistic attempts. You're creating right now. I am copying. Replicating. There is no soul in my work. She turned to him, her form shifting to something more humanoid, as if trying to physically understand his perspective. Our species faces a crisis, Commander. We have engineered ourselves into stagnation. Our children are born knowing everything their parents knew, their genetic memory a perfect record of our accumulated knowledge. But they never learn to question, to wonder, to create. Sullivan felt a chill run down his spine. This was far more serious than a simple cultural exchange. Is that why you contacted us? Because humans still have the capacity for original thought. Partially, Nixis admitted. But there is more. Our predictive models show our civilization reaching a terminal point within the next century. Without the ability to truly innovate, to create new solutions to new problems, we will eventually face a challenge we cannot adapt to. She glided closer, her presence making the air tingle with bioelectric energy. We need to understand how humans maintain their creativity despite advancing technology. How you preserve your capacity for innovation even as you accumulate knowledge. Sullivan thought carefully before responding. This wasn't just about art anymore, it was about the survival of an entire species. Your Majesty, creativity isn't something that can be engineered or implanted. It comes from struggle, from failure, from the messy process of trying and failing and trying again. Then teach me to fail, she said, her voice carrying an edge of desperation. Teach me to be imperfect. The request hung in the air between them, its implications staggering. The queen of a species that had dedicated itself to perfection was asking to learn imperfection. Sullivan realized he was standing at a crossroads of history, his next words could determine the fate of two civilizations. Learning to fail isn't easy, he said finally. It requires vulnerability. Are you prepared for that? Nixis's form shifted again, and for a moment, Sullivan caught a glimpse of something beneath her carefully controlled exterior, fear, perhaps, or hope. I am prepared to do whatever is necessary to save my people. Even if it means unlearning everything we have become. Sullivan nodded slowly, an idea forming in his mind. Then let's start with something simple. Instead of trying to replicate existing art, let's create something new. Together. He approached one of her attempted paintings, a copy of Van Gogh's Starry Night. Tell me, when you look at the stars from your world, what do you feel? Feel? She seemed confused. We observe. We catalogue. We do not. Don't think, Sullivan interrupted gently. Don't analyze. Just look at the stars and tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. The queen was silent for a long moment, her form shifting like quicksilver as she struggled with the concept. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. They dance. Sullivan smiled. That's it. That's creativity, seeing something familiar in a new way. Now, let's try to capture that dance. As they began to work, neither of them noticed the subtle changes in the palace walls, where new patterns were forming, patterns that had never existed before in the history of Nexian architecture. The first tremors of change were beginning to ripple through the perfect world of the Nexians, and there would be no going back. The news spread through the Nexian hivenet like a virus, their queen was changing. In the 2 weeks since Commander Sullivan's arrival, Queen Nixis had begun exhibiting unprecedented behaviors. Her normally pristine geometric patterns had become irregular, her form shifting in ways that defied the established protocols of their species. More disturbing still, she had begun to create. Sullivan stood before the Nexian High Council, 12 ancient beings whose forms had remained unchanged for centuries. Their disapproval radiated like physical waves through the chamber. You misunderstand our purpose, Commander, Counselor Veth's voice was cold, precise. We did not invite you here to disrupt our society's harmony. With respect, Counselor, Sullivan replied, maintaining his diplomatic composure, your queen invited me here precisely for that purpose. She recognizes that harmony without growth is stagnation. And what of the disruptions? Another counselor demanded. The younger generations are beginning to question their predetermined roles. There are reports of unauthorized artistic expression in the lower levels. Some have even begun attempting to modify their forms without proper genetic approval. Sullivan fought back a smile. He had seen the changes himself, subtle alterations in the architecture, new patterns in the bioluminescent displays, even attempts at music in the crystalline gardens. The Nexians were awakening to their own creative potential, and it terrified their leaders. Change is never comfortable, he acknowledged. But it's necessary for survival. Your own predictive models dash. Our models are not your concern, Veth interrupted. The Queen's fascination with human chaos must end. We have maintained our society's perfection for millennia. We will not allow it to be undermined by artistic expression. The way Veth pronounced the words made them sound like a disease. Before Sullivan could respond, the chamber's doors dissolved, and Queen Nixis entered. The council members recoiled slightly. Her form was barely contained now, swirling with colors that had never been seen in their species. You speak of perfection, she said, her voice carrying new harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very walls. But what is perfect about a species that cannot grow? What is perfect about a civilization that fears its own evolution? My queen, Veth began, you are not thinking clearly. The human's influence has shown me what we have lost, she interrupted. Look at this. With a gesture, she transformed one wall of the chamber into a display of human history. These beings, whom we considered primitive, have survived catastrophes that would have destroyed our perfect society. They have faced extinction-level events, wars, plagues, and environmental disasters. And each time, they survived through adaptation and creativity. Through chaos and suffering, another counselor objected. Yes, Nixis agreed. Through chaos and suffering and joy and love, through the full spectrum of existence that we denied ourselves in our pursuit of perfection. Sullivan watched the exchange with growing concern. He had seen similar reactions throughout human history, the fear of change, the desperate clutching to the familiar. But there was something else here, something in the way the council members were arranging themselves. Your Majesty, he said quietly, I believe we should continue this discussion elsewhere. She turned to him, her newly developed intuition picking up on his tone. What is wrong? The council isn't just here to debate, he replied, his years of diplomatic experience screaming warnings. They're here to stop you. As if confirming his suspicions, the chamber's exits sealed themselves. Veth's form expanded, becoming more authoritative. My queen, you leave us no choice. By the authority of the Genetic Preservation Act, we must insist on your immediate psychological reconstruction. Reconstruction? Sullivan demanded, stepping closer to Nixis. You mean wiping her mind? Restoring her to her proper form, Veth corrected. The human's influence will be removed, and order will be restored. Nixis's form flared with colors that seemed to burn the air itself. You would strip away my growth. My understanding. Everything I have learned. We would save you from this madness, Veth insisted. Your creativity is a mutation, a flaw that must be corrected. Sullivan felt the temperature in the chamber dropping as the council members began to exert their collective will. They were trying to force the queen into a regeneration cycle, a process that would reset her to her original state. But Nixis was no longer the same being they had known. In her weeks of studying human creativity, she had learned something her species had forgotten centuries ago, the power of choice. No, she said, and the simple word carried enough force to crack the crystalline floors. I choose to change. I choose to grow. And I am not alone. The chamber walls suddenly came alive with movement, and Sullivan realized they weren't just walls anymore. Throughout the palace, throughout the entire city, the living architecture that the Nexians had engineered to perfection was beginning to express itself in new ways. The revolution wasn't just in their queen, it was in every cell of their engineered world. What have you done? Veth whispered, horror evident in their voice. Nixis turned to Sullivan, her form radiating with purpose. I have learned the most important human lesson of all, Commander. The perfect moment to create something new is when they tell you it's impossible. The chamber erupted into chaos as the very foundations of Nexian society began to transform. Sullivan could only watch as centuries of careful engineering gave way to the unstoppable force of creative expression. The price of knowledge was change, and change, once begun, could not be contained. The aftermath of what historians would later call the creative revolution rippled through both human and Nexian space. Commander Sullivan stood in the newly formed chamber of synthesis, watching as the walls pulsed with patterns that somehow managed to be both chaotic and harmonious. 3 months had passed since the confrontation with the High Council, and nothing was the same. The latest reports from Earth are mixed, he told Queen Nixis, who was experimenting with a new form that combined Nexian fluidity with human-inspired structure. Some factions are calling for an immediate cessation of cultural exchange. They fear we're giving away too much of our creative heritage. And in return gaining nothing. Nixis's laugh was like wind chimes in a storm. Do they not see the medical advances our biological knowledge has already provided? The improvements to their space travel technology? Sullivan smiled wryly. Humans can be as resistant to change as Nexians. Fear works the same way in both species. Around them, the chamber continued its endless dance of transformation. Young Nexians, freed from the rigid genetic programming of their ancestors, were developing new forms of expression that combined their species' biological mastery with human-inspired creativity. The results were both beautiful and terrifying. We've received another petition from the Conservative Coalition, Sullivan continued, bringing up a holographic display. They're demanding that we establish strict guidelines for cultural exchange. They want to control what aspects of human creativity can be shared. Control creativity? Nixis shook her head, sending ripples of iridescent light through her form. They understand nothing. Creativity cannot be contained or directed. It must be free to flow where it will. Like your architecture. Sullivan gestured to the ever-changing walls. Since the revolution, the Nexian cities had become living art installations, their structures constantly evolving in response to the emotions and ideas of their inhabitants. Precisely. Look at this. She waved a tendril, and a section of the wall transformed into a display of recent Nexian innovations. In 3 months, we have developed more truly new technologies than in the previous century. Our young ones are not just replicating existing knowledge, they are creating new possibilities. Sullivan studied the display with growing amazement. The Nexians' newfound creativity, combined with their biological expertise, had led to breakthroughs that seemed almost magical. Living starships that could adapt to any environment, medical techniques that could cure diseases before they manifested, even early experiments in combining human consciousness with Nexian biological engineering. It's remarkable, he admitted. But it's also dangerous. Some of these innovations could be weaponized. Anything can be weaponized, Nixis countered. That's why we need balance. The precision of Nexian science tempered by human creativity and wisdom. Neither species can handle this transformation alone. She was right, of course. The past months had shown that the combination of human imagination and Nexian biological mastery could either elevate both species or destroy them. Everything depended on how they managed the integration. We need a framework, Sullivan said, his diplomatic mind already working on solutions. Not to control the exchange, but to guide it. To ensure that both species learn from each other without losing their essential nature. A bridge between stars, Nixis mused. But how do we build it? Before Sullivan could respond, an alert flashed across his neural interface. His face grew serious as he read the message. We may need to figure it out quickly. The Earth Council is convening an emergency session. There's been an incident. Nixis's form shifted, reflecting her concern. What kind of incident? A group of human extremists broke into one of the new cultural exchange centers. They were trying to steal Nexian biological technology. In the process, they were exposed to an experimental form of consciousness expansion. The dreaming spores? Nixis's color darkened. Those are highly unstable. They weren't ready for human testing. Sullivan nodded grimly. The survivors are changed. They're exhibiting abilities we don't understand. Some are calling it the next step in human evolution. Others are calling it an invasion of the human genome. They fear we are trying to transform them as we transformed ourselves, Nixis realized. They do not understand that true transformation must come from within. Fear rarely understands anything, Sullivan said. We need to act fast. If we don't find a way to bridge this gap soon, both our species could retreat into isolation. All this progress, all this growth, it could be lost. Nixis was quiet for a moment, her form rippling with complex patterns that reflected her deep thought. Then she said something that made Sullivan's heart skip a beat. Perhaps, she said slowly, it is time for me to visit Earth. The implications of her words hung in the air between them. No Nexian monarch had ever left their homeworld. The political, cultural, and security implications were staggering. Yet as Sullivan looked at the continuously evolving chamber around them, he realized that they had long since passed the point of playing it safe. That would be unprecedented, he said carefully. We live in unprecedented times, Commander, she replied. If we are to build this bridge between stars, perhaps we must be willing to cross the void ourselves. Sullivan looked at his longtime companion and realized that she was right. They had started this journey together, watching a symphony and discussing art. Now they stood at the brink of the greatest cultural exchange in human history. The path ahead was uncertain, but uncertainty, he had learned, was where the most beautiful creations were born. The United Earth Council chamber had never hosted anything quite like this before. The ancient hall, with its towering marble columns and gleaming metal accents, seemed almost mundane compared to its current occupant. Queen Nixis floated in the center of the chamber, her form a constantly shifting aurora of colors and patterns that reflected off the polished surfaces, transforming the entire room into a living art installation. Commander Sullivan stood beside her, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes fixed upon them, both human and artificial. The emergency session was being broadcast across Earth and its colonies, and even to the furthest human outposts. This moment would shape the future of both species. Distinguished members of the council, Nixis began, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to sing, I come before you not just as the queen of the Nexians, but as a student of humanity. She gestured, and the air around her filled with floating images, human art, music, dance, and literature, each piece somehow enhanced and transformed by her unique interpretation. Your species taught mine how to dream again. You showed us that perfection without growth is merely stagnation. And look what that knowledge has wrought, Counselor Pierce interrupted, his voice sharp with accusation. Unauthorized genetic modifications, consciousness-altering spores, living technology that defies control. You've turned our cultural exchange centers into incubators of chaos. Sullivan stepped forward. Counselor, with respect, chaos and creativity are two sides of the same coin. Yes, there have been incidents, but look at what we've gained. He brought up his own display, showing the medical breakthroughs, the environmental restoration projects, the new forms of art and expression that had emerged from the collaboration. We're not just talking about art and music anymore, he continued. The synthesis of human creativity with Nexian biological mastery has opened doors we never knew existed. We're curing diseases that plagued us for centuries, cleaning our oceans with living filters, developing sustainable technologies that work in harmony with nature rather than against it. At what cost? Another counselor demanded. Our reports show increasing instances of unauthorized genetic experimentation. People are changing themselves, incorporating Nexian biological principles without proper oversight. Where does it end? Nixis's form pulsed with something that might have been amusement. Where does any exploration end? Where did your own species' journey end when you first looked up at the stars and dreamed of reaching them? She moved through the chamber, her presence leaving trailing echoes of light and color. Yes, there are risks. Yes, there will be mistakes. But consider this, in the 3 months since our revolution, my species has experienced more growth, more genuine evolution, than in the previous millennium. And humans, through their interaction with our biology, are beginning to unlock potential they never knew they had. We're not talking about potential, Pierce shot back. We're talking about the fundamental alteration of what it means to be human. And what does it mean to be human? Sullivan asked quietly. The chamber fell silent as he continued. When we first reached the stars, we thought we were ready for anything. But we weren't ready for the Nexians, a species so advanced, so perfect, that they had engineered themselves into an evolutionary dead end. We weren't ready to see our own possible future in their stagnation. He walked to the center of the chamber, standing in the shifting lights of Nixus's presence. But we were ready for something else. We were ready to share what makes us human, our creativity, our passion, our willingness to try and fail and try again. And in doing so, we didn't just help the Nexians. We opened ourselves to new possibilities, new ways of being. Nixus moved closer to him, her form resolving briefly into something almost human. We do not seek to change what humans are, she said softly. We seek to help you become more of what you already are, creators, dreamers, explorers of the possible. The chamber erupted in debate, but Sullivan noticed something interesting. The younger council members were watching Nixus with fascination rather than fear. They saw in her what he had seen months ago, not a threat to humanity, but a bridge to its next chapter. I propose a compromise, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. We established the Synthesis Initiative, a controlled program of cultural and biological exchange. Voluntary participation, strict safety protocols, but with the explicit goal of exploring the full potential of both species. Under whose authority? Pierce demanded. Under joint authority, Nixus answered. A council of both humans and Nexians, working together to guide this transformation. Not to control it, you cannot control evolution any more than you can control art, but to ensure it serves the highest good of both our species. She raised her hands, and the chamber filled with a display more magnificent than any before, a vision of the future where human creativity and Nexian mastery had fully merged. Living cities that grew in harmony with their inhabitants, starships that could think and adapt, humans and Nexians working together to reshape the very fabric of reality. This is not the end of either of our species, she said, her voice rich with emotion, an ability she had learned from humans. It is the beginning of something greater than either of us could achieve alone. Sullivan watched as the council members studied the display, saw the moment when fear began to give way to wonder. He thought back to that first meeting in the Nexian palace, when a queen asked him to teach her how to dream. Now she was teaching humanity how to transform those dreams into reality. The vote stands at a deadlock, the council president announced after the debate had raged for hours. Commander Sullivan, as the architect of this exchange, your vote will decide. Sullivan looked at Nixus, saw in her ever-shifting form the perfect blend of precision and possibility. Then he looked at his fellow humans, saw in their eyes the same hunger for discovery that had first driven them to the stars. I vote yes, he said simply. Not because it's safe, but because it's necessary. Because the greatest creations always come from the courage to imagine something new. As the chamber erupted in a mix of cheers and protests, Nixus's form blazed with colors that had no names in any human language. The bridge between stars had been built. What would cross it remained to be seen, but one thing was certain, neither species would ever be the same. And that, Sullivan realized, was exactly the point.